morning. We're very happy to have you. If you can, we're going to look at Hebrews chapter number 11 together. So if you can, go ahead and turn in your Bibles with me to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're looking at, we're continuing to look at the faith of the patriarchs. So right now we're looking at the faith of Abraham, who has just, according to Hebrews 11, inside of the grand scheme of things, he is just leaving his country for a better country, and he realizes that the promise may not be realized in his life, but that it's representing, as Canaan does, a better place, which for us and for him would represent heaven. And so he realizes that he is a stranger and a sojourner on this planet, and that he is only here to carry out promises of God, even though they will not be fulfilled in his lifetime. And so he realizes that grander scheme here, and he says, because I look forward to the greater land of promise, heaven itself, and he calls it a heavenly country. Hebrews 11, verse 16. That was, for he has prepared a city for them. That would be for all those who are looking like him, as in this patriarchal age before Moses, looking for the better country. Okay, and so then in verse 17, we are introduced to the faith of Abraham under trial. So the first one was the faith of Abraham inside of his immense and immediate step of faith. Now we're looking at his magnitude of his trial. And so verse 17 of Hebrews 11 reads, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Now, when we stop here for a moment, we understand that all of God's promises to Abraham were, as the old saying goes, yea and amen in Isaac. Everything pointed to Isaac. The very first promise to Abraham, found in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, had Isaac and then Jacob, and then you go on down the line in that peripheral. Now, there's when you look at this, so Abraham's 75 when he leaves Ur of Chaldees. He's hitting the door of 100 years old when Isaac is born. He has waited 25 years for the birth of Isaac. He was a 100-year-old individual. It's pretty interesting. What's interesting is there's a U.S. president that had kids until he was 85 years old. Who was that? Was that Tyler? He had over 70 kids, something like that. Was it Tyler? I can't remember who it was. But anyway, Abraham didn't have that. Okay, this was his only child, and he waited for a very old age to have it. So, obviously, that was Isaac, 25 years. Excuse me. And now here is Isaac, and he's being offered up, according to Genesis 22, on that altar, where in verse 3 of Genesis 22, God told Sarah that I and the lad are going to go yonder to worship. And then they go up the mountain, and then also God says, take this, your only son, your only beloved son, put him on the altar, bind him up, put wood, and Isaac even carried wood up there with him. Put wood around him, and then you're going to have to kill him with a knife. Now, of course, when the knife was mid-action, of course, God spoke and says, now that I know you would have done it. Here's the ram in the bushes. Go get that ram and put him on the altar instead as a substitute. So there's a lot of things dealing with a symbolic, figurative language that points us toward Jesus. And so this case, the account of Abraham and Isaac was a shadow of things to come. You have the essence, the substance of Jesus there, casting the shadow back to the Old Testament. And now we understand that he was looking forward to this because he realized, and when you look at Hebrews 11, and if you go on down, that he realized that, he probably would have raised him back up. There would have been a resurrection of sorts because he knew that the promises had to come to fruition through Isaac. And so there's your idea of being offered up. Now, if you take away Isaac, nothing remained. Verse 18 of Hebrews 11, of course, says, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Now, it's interesting here is that was there any other kid before Isaac, though? Ishmael. All right. Now, let's look at this for a minute. Go back to Genesis 17. And we're going to look at, you kind of about the phrase, now I always say this phrase wrong. My wife usually laughs hysterically behind my back when I say it. When you make plans, God laughs at them. Is that the phrase? Great. Look at that. First time for everything. All right. Look at Genesis 17. I saw all kind of stuff with that one. I couldn't tell you where to begin. But anyway, Genesis 17. Now let's look at verse 15 through 18. Really some interesting stuff as you kind of get some context for this by Ishmael, Isaac. Genesis 17, verse 15 and following says, and God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Israel shall be her name, and I will bless her, and you will give her a son by her, and I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations, kings of peoples shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face, and we understand that he fell on his face, and he did what? He laughed about it. How about that? And said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. It's interesting. So here's a negotiation period. He's bargaining. Do you think, with this statement right here, that he was satisfied with Ishmael? I think when you look at what Abraham said, Abraham said to God, it's okay. I same thing I did the first time myself. Abraham, it seems to be, was satisfied with Ishmael. He thought, here's your child right here, God. Have you forgotten Ishmael? Then God said, verse 19, no. What you got, Horace?
I can probably interject some experience thinking into this. Okay. Now, Abraham, at the time that he got that promise, was literally past the age of being able to, from a biblical standpoint, understand that he could actually be able to impregnate Sarah.
Yeah.
And that could be, as you notice it said in that verse, he laughed in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was something that was really, even though God was telling him that, it wasn't something he could even fathom, even though God was telling him that.
Yeah. Well, he thought Ishmael was the one that he was looking for.
And that's what he's saying.
Yeah.
He's going back to what already has happened. And he's thinking that he's talking about Israel. Because he didn't give him any name, he just said he's going to have a son
Mhm.
by Sarah.
Yeah.
And see, that could be what was happening because he's looking at the fact he's past the age of even impregnating Sarah, and Sarah is past the age of actually childbearing.
Right. Yeah.
There's another translation on 18, God's word is in Abraham says to God, why not let this mill be there?
Okay. What version is that?
God's word.
They've interpreted it for you, but the same thing.
You know, what about my version?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, because Ishmael was his firstborn technically, but not the promised. Yeah, that's the difference. And Paul brings up at least twice, I think 3 times inside of his writings about it, saying here's the difference between the uncircumcised, the faithless generation, or like Ishmael and Hagar, and here's the promised seed. I'm thinking about Galatians 3 there. It's all through Isaac and Jerusalem and that kind of thing. Go on.
Ishmael.
Yeah. 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 And that was a very big difference. Yeah, because, and to me, I feel like he takes a similar approach to how Eve did with Cain in Genesis 4, how, right after God pronounced a promise, of the first seed, the first seed promise to Adam and Eve, there we go. And then, she understood it's going to be a man, it's going to be the Redeemer. She knew that much. But then in Genesis 4:1, she says, Lord gave me a man when Cain was born. Well, I feel like she thought Cain was going to be her Redeemer, her kinsman Redeemer type thing, but he wasn't. And so I think it's kind of maybe a similar mindset here, maybe with Abraham. I've already got my man here. What more do I need? Go ahead. Yeah.
Verse 19, God tells him, he said, and God said, Sarah thy wife bare thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and he is a keeper. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him.
Mm-hmm.
So see, basically, he's actually, God is actually telling him, hey, this promise I gave you, it's being enacted. And it's in process.
Yeah.
And he actually told us that, the covenant is not going to be, Isaac is not the covenant. Ishmael is not the covenant child. Isaac is the covenant child.
Right. And we know that when you read the verses here, verses 19 and 21, that God still gives a covenant to an extent with Ishmael, but it's a whole different one. So right here in Genesis 17, verse 19, it says, then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, because also Hagar was the handmaiden, not the wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. Verse 19. Genesis 17:20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. And my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year. And so then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. And of course, then we know that the rest of the story goes that Ishmael was sent away. And verse 25, Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised. Very same day, Abraham circumcised with his son Ishmael, and all the house of and all men of his house, born in the house of bought with money, a foreigner, were circumcised from him or with him. And that's an interesting little phrase too, because he even saw it kind of again as Ishmael is all dealing with the promise here from that whole incident there. But yet God still said Isaac, he's going to come later. Will be who you're looking for this time next year. So straight away, he's going right into it. Go ahead.
From a religious standpoint, the Jews circumcised on the 8th day. From the view of Islam, they circumcised in the 13th year.
Okay, I never knew that. Scary stuff. Well, I'm not Muslim.
And if you look at the way God blessed Ishmael, there's kind of a parallel. He had 12 sons as well.
Hmm? Yeah.
So it was one generation.
Right. Yeah, and Ishmael's descendants become the Canaanites, and then they become obviously the Mohammedans or Mohammedans. That's the old school way of saying it, but the Muslim individuals take their promises from Ishmael. Yeah, it's interesting. All right. Now, this has a grander context here. So this is all dealing with the magnitude of Abraham's trial. And then when you look at this, of course, when you look at verse number 19 again, he's showing us that, of course, if Isaac, his only begotten, as Hebrews says it, the promised child was to be put to death on behalf of Abraham's test, Hebrews 11:19 says that he was going to be resurrected. So then you have the idea here of the magnificence of Abraham's trust in God. And so it comes down to all this, of course, to me, this is an interesting little sidestep because the grander scheme of Hebrews is all dealing with keeping Christians saved, okay? Keeping them out of Judaism, going back into Judaism. And so he's going to hold up now Abraham and Isaac as a character study, if you will, as a faith study. He's going to say, look at what they did by trial and trust, and understand that Abraham was obedient with God. And even though Ishmael thought, I know more, Abraham thought, I know more, God still said, I have my promise. And so all of it to me is really trying to impression the Hebrew audience that there's a grander scope of work being done, the grander promise, even in your own Christianity, that is at stake here if you leave it. And so he's trying to, I think, give more of a the only way I think about is the word grit, but more traction to this. That as a Christian, because the Bible says in Galatians 3 that you and I are heirs of Abraham, but now we're not doing that in a physical way, but by faith. Galatians 3, verse 27 through 29 there. So it's all, I think, playing with a bigger thing here in the background. Of course, I'll be dealing with Christianity. And so verse number 19, though, of Hebrews 11, of course, we looks forward to Christ's death and resurrection because it had happened. And so surely with evidence of this fact, the common knowledge of Jerusalem, they could believe. Abraham could believe without such evidence to buoy his faith. Could they not believe in the face of all overwhelming evidence for Christ's resurrection from the dead? And then you see verses 20 through 22 here. Now we're going to transition to the next three, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph in Hebrews 11. So we see in Isaac there's a foreshadowing of the future on the individual level. So each one of these, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. plays a different role in how the future is going to look. Isaac is his faith was concerned with the individual level. Jacob is concerned with a future on a tribal level. Here's my sons. Blessings on the tribe, Genesis 49 to 50. Then Joseph is concerned with a future on a national level. Okay, so Isaac dealing with this individual level here. Jacob and Esau were twins, but we understand that, we know that from this standpoint, that Isaac was one that was, it would seem to be that he favored Esau. But because of how everything went down there with Esau and Jacob, that, of course, Esau would eventually subside, and then the inheritance would be given to the aggressor, or Jacob. Because we know that Esau, it's been said in the past that Esau was the one you could trust your house and your keys to. Jacob, you couldn't, because Jacob was one that was, his very name means supplanter. The one's going to twist your arm behind your back when you ain't looking. That's the idea there. He was seen as a deceitful individual. And Esau was seen as a very trustworthy man, probably more of like a kingly type of individual, more than Jacob. And yet, all of God's promises pointed toward Jacob. And we know that it came to fruition there at this point in time with Jacob and Esau. During this interesting back and forth, because in Genesis 25, verse 23, God made a promise. And he said that the elder shall serve the younger. That's an interesting phrase in Genesis 25, verse 23. And so, right from then and there, of course, Esau was, if you look at Esau, I have three things here. Esau was, had three basic elements in a patriarchal promise or blessing. The first thing was that he was the one who had the right to be the one through whom the line of the Messiah would run, because of the promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob. He understood Esau, there we go, change names here, was going to be the one that he thought was going to bring in the Messiah, most likely. When you look at this, secondly, he had a right to a position of priest in the family. Very important, because this is a patriarchal age where the head of household is also the priest for the household. And thirdly, he had a right to a double portion of the family property. And this one is the only one that really interested Esau. The other two didn't really interest him as much at all. Jacob was the one that had all these things given to him instead. Jacob had the Messiah from his lineage. Jacob had the right of priesthood from the standpoint of the patriarchal side. And, of course, Jacob was given double inheritance at the end. Now, it's interesting here that just as a kind of a circling back around here inside of the New Testament now, does anyone know what family became or came from Esau when he left? Edomites, okay? And where do those guys go? They're land of Edom. They were across the river, weren't they? They were in the mountains, and so they were up there in the mountains, and as Jerusalem and the book of Obadiah is written to the Edomites, as Jerusalem was being attacked and pillaged and ravaged, they were up there laughing about it. What do you call it? Divine justice has set in. Poetry in motion. Here it is. And Obadiah went to him and says, "You're a fool. He is your brother." What are you doing? But the Edomites will become another group called the Idumeans. You ever heard of an Idumean? Anyone heard that word? Great. Well, I'll tell you who is in that family. That is a family that will become Herod the Great. How about that? Isn't that crazy? A full circle there. So Herod the Great, and what was his problem? He was a paranoid individual. And what did he try to do? You remember what he tried to do? Huh? He wanted to kill Jesus. Matthew 2. Huh? Yeah. Herod, listen to this. I found this. Toward the end of his life, Herod became increasingly paranoid about potential coups or uprisings, and had several of his sons and his most beloved wife, Maria Mini, give it your best, executed to forestall what he feared were attempts to overthrow him. At one point, Caesar Augustus ironically remarked that he would rather be Herod's pig, for which a Jew would not kill, than his son, which Herod would kill. Isn't that crazy? He did. And it was his temple that was eradicated in AD 70. He's the one that did that. But he was seen as a very, now later in life, he was kind of a born and bred politician. Okay? This guy, if you want history, and I don't know a lot of my history about Caesars. I know a little bit when I read stuff. But I remember probably vaguely about the incident between, who was it, Mark Antony and Brutus going against Octavian and the other one. Who was it? Anyway, Mark Antony and Brutus were the ones that did not win the battle. Okay? And then it went to Octavian. And Octavian, he was the idea of Vespasian. He was the one that was in charge of Jerusalem's destruction. Vespasian was an interesting character. But this guy, Herod the Great, actually sided with the enemy of Rome, which would be back in the historical side of Mark Antony. He was with Mark Antony. He thought Caesars were crazy and they were going to just create lots of issues. And then after Mark Antony died, he began to do a lot of very extravagant things to try to show he can be trusted in the eyes of Caesar. And so he was seen as a very fickle individual, but he was also granted, because of how a previous Caesar had set up Israel with Idumeans in charge of Jerusalem and Galilee, that Herod the Great came into power. And Herod the Great is all from Esau's lineage. And so you can only imagine the stories he would have heard growing up, being from a family that had a very deep dysfunctionality toward his brother's family. And now here's a king coming from my brother's family. Down the line a little ways. What are we going to do about it? You're going to take it from me again. We're going to try to kill him. Matthew 2. Then we see the infanticide coming there, ages 2 and under. And then we know that Christ would, with his family, well, as a baby there, they went down to Egypt to be saved from that. But it's interesting that all that kind of comes full circle here. And so you see that right here with Isaac and with Jacob Christ is from Jacob's lineage, and Esau is from Herod from Esau's. All right, so then I'm doing okay on my time. I got 10 minutes. Very good. So then we have, next case is that of Jacob here in Hebrews 11, verse number 21. So Jacob, Isaac and Jacob foresaw the individual side. They didn't plan too big, but they knew things are going to be getting bigger as they went on because of the promise. But Hebrews 11, I'm in James. Hebrews 11, verse 21. Now, goes back and says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, now you can look at that back in Genesis 49 here, where he gives all those promises, all the sons at his deathbed. When he was dying, blessed each of his sons, the sons of Joseph, and worshiped leaning on the top of a staff. By faith, Joseph, now here's the national level, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Now, verse 21, there's some discussion there about his staff, because when you look at Genesis 49, you don't read that he had a staff. He was just laying in bed, and he summoned them. The discussion comes in, depending on who you look at for your commentary here, that the staff represented authority, perhaps, or he stayed in bed. He had a staff next to his bed. Either way, he still was in bed because he was an old individual and dying and all kinds of stuff. So I don't know how to tell you how that came out in this verse, but that's what happened. But anyway, you see that he blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Now it's interesting because when you look at this, the scene here back in Genesis 49, Joseph was where during that time? Was he in Israel or Canaan, or was he somewhere else? Egypt. And Joseph, you know how many sons Joseph had? 2. You know who the names were? Keep prodding. It's Ephraim and Manasseh. All right. I knew you knew it. You were just playing with me. All right. And according to Hosea 7, verse 16, as well as Jeremiah 31, 18 to 20, at the time when Ephraim was a synonym with Israel for the northern tribes. All 10 tribes were called Ephraim at some point in time inside of the biblical record. But Manasseh also was seen as a very big inheritance in the south side. So when you look at all this, of course, he's going to, I think, look toward Israel, and he's doing it from more of a tribal level. This is what's going to happen now. Here is Joseph. He's going to protect us. He's going to take us out of this land of bondage. And we know that that's what happened, because one of the true pickers of the book of Exodus was found in Exodus 1, verse 5, where it said the Pharaoh who raised up did not know who. He didn't know Joseph. And that was, I think, a very pivotal point into why the Exodus even happened. Because here you have a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, who didn't care about Joseph. I think he knew him. I think part of their things that they have to know all of the pharaohs to understand how things work, kind of how that political side works there. But the idea is he did not respect Joseph. I think he knew him, though. As a side note, according to historical productions, Joseph is seen as one of the first philosophers of the old world. And he is seen as the one that temporarily brought all of Egypt into what's called monotheism, away from paganism. And his sons were also ones that carried on that until they left. They were exiled. So it's interesting here that all of this, I think, points just toward Joseph now instead of the other 12. But we understand that, when you look at Genesis 49 again, that the blessing was put on Judah to bring in the Savior, Genesis 49, verses 9 and 10, and then on Joseph to bring out the people. Okay? So, that's on a tribal level. And let me look at my notes. I'm going to skip over all this. Okay. And then we look at Jacob really quick. Verse number 22. Joseph foresaw the future on a national level, because also he brought out the children of Israel from slavery. Exodus 1:8. Knew not Joseph, not 5. That's verse 8. And so, of course, then it's interesting here that what is said of Joseph. What did he want to do? According to Hebrews 11, verse 22. He knew he wouldn't see the promised land. He knew it. He knew he was stuck in Egypt until he died. What did he want to happen with him, with his body afterward? Bring his bones and put him in the promised land, please. How about that? 3 times in your Bible, Joseph's bones are mentioned. Each of them, it seems, has kind of a message behind it. The first one is God will bring you out. He knew that eventually they're going to leave because the promise is still in effect. He knew that eventually they're going to have to go to the promised land because they're looking for a promised Messiah. And so Joseph understood that bring my bones with you because God will bring you out. So there's a symbolism there attached to it. It's interesting that Joseph was not tempted to become like Egypt, being attracted by its temptations, treasures, and teachings. When you look at Genesis 50, verse 24, and the question is, what strengthened Joseph to do this? He says, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And then Exodus 13, verse 19. So his bones say that God will bring you out. Exodus 13, verse 19. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had placed the children of Israel under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you will carry up my bones from here with you. Interesting phrase. And so now we have the bones of Joseph shouting, if you will, saying God will bring you through it. He will bring you through it. And then in Joshua 24, verse 32, the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt. Been a long time they've had those things with them, haven't they? But they buried them at Shechem, the plot of ground which Jacob had brought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. And so God will bring you in. Will be what the bones will be shouting. God will take you out, carry you through, and bring you in. And so right here, it seems to be that Joseph it would seem because of his instructions, and they carried on with those teachings very strongly. It would seem to be that Joseph had a mentality of understanding of a resurrection time. I'm going to see the land someday. It makes you wonder. Now, I don't think that it happened, but it's an interesting side to think about that when Jesus died, one of the things that happened was that the dead were raised and walking through Jerusalem. Wouldn't it be interesting if Joseph was walking through Jerusalem, going along, seeing his neighbors and friends, not his, but seeing his family there? We don't know if that happened. That's just something to think about. But Joseph's bones, though, were, I think, dealing with a grander scheme of redemption. He understood that he wants to be there. Even though he can't see it for himself, he wants his body to be in that place. So, the writer of Hebrews here is trying to bring to this truth that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all look to the future, as well as Joseph. The past has lessons, but it was in the future that the promises will be fulfilled. The early Hebrew Christians had to learn this truth because Israel's remarkable history was all well and good, but they had to look away from that to the future. Just as Joseph foresaw being changes, so these early Christians had to move with the times. It could not cling to the past at the expense of the future. It had to go in step with God's purposes. All right. I'm going to stop. Is there anything else really quick that y'all want to make mention of or question? I'm right on time. Thankfully. All right. We'll stop then. Next week, we'll pick up in Hebrews 11, verse 23. Thank you for being in class today. I appreciate it very much. We'll have you in a few minutes.